Welcome to Khirbet el-Maqatir and a journey through biblical history. We're very proud that right here in Pikeville, Kentucky, you can visit a world-class archaeology exhibit of artifacts from the world of the ancient world of the Bible, Israel, Egypt, and Jordan, right here in Pikeville. Now, what we're going to do today is we're going to take you on a brief tour of what's going on at the York House in Pikeville, Kentucky, and we're going to walk through the ages of the Bible and ancient history of the ancient Near East. Now, we're going to talk today primarily about one site, and that is a place called Khirbet el-Maqatir. Now, Khirbet el-Maqatir, that is the modern Arabic for ruin of Maqatir. That's the modern name. I tell people if you come back and visit Pikeville in 2,000 years, we're probably not going to call it Pikeville anymore. It's going to have something different. So one of the journeys we're going to go on today is, what was this place, Khirbet el-Maqatir, 2,000 years ago, 3,500 years ago, and talk about how it actually appears in the biblical account. So what we're going to do today is do an archaeological journey. And if you were to visit the Middle East and you were to volunteer on an archaeology dig on a tale and you start digging down, you're going to start with the youngest artifacts and dig to the oldest. So that's how we're going to journey today. We're going to journey from the youngest stuff to the oldest stuff. And so what we want to do first is look at the youngest artifact on display today. And so let me take you to the medieval world and the world of the Crusaders. So here we have a medieval holy water font. And I tell people this is the most brand new thing on exhibit, in the museum exhibit, because it's only around probably 800 years old. Now we're doing a little research on it yet, but one of our archaeologists tells us this is probably a holy water font, and it may likely even be Crusader, if you can see the cross here on it. So that's from an exciting period of history that a lot's going on. So we see, as we begin to walk backwards in history, one of the youngest things you'll see on display here. Now what we want to talk about is dating. This is 800 years old, and how does that compare to other things that we have on display in the museum exhibit? So let's talk just a brief bit about dating and how archaeologists come up with dates when they dig up sites in the Middle East. So we've already seen one artifact that dates to 800 years ago. So one of the things we do for our visitors here is we walk you from room to room, is we walk you into different ages of archaeology and ages of the Bible. So what's going on at specific times. So when we talk about archaeology, we'll talk about different periods. Maybe we're talking about the Bronze Ages, and we're talking about times of the patriarchs and the early biblical stories, or the Iron Age and the period of men like David, Solomon, Hezekiah, down to the Roman period where we get to the famous era of the New Testament. Now, when we're talking about dating and all of these ages and how the archaeology ages relate to the world of the Bible, how do archaeologists come up with these numbers that say, hey, this is so many years old? Well, one of the common ways they do it is with pottery, and pottery shards to what we call relative dating. So let's look at a couple pieces real quick. Now, one of the things we think is exciting is when you visit our exhibit, you get the chance to actually hold a little bit of ancient pottery in your hands. For example, this small piece of pottery, you can look at it closely and see that the strong top of a rim here, this is the top of a large pithos jar. So this has been part of the top of a large vessel that was as big as a man probably. I mean, it was very big. And what's kind of exciting about this particular piece, the archaeologists date it for us to the Iron 2A, so roughly 1000 to 925 BC, or ballpark of the period of men named David and Solomon. Now the other one here I want to show you is the bottom of a bowl. We don't need to be an archaeologist to be able to recognize that this is a bowl. And what's kind of cool is, look at the lines in it. Well, even an amateur archaeologist, when they see that, can say, hey, I recognize that style. And the style of that tells me this is sometime in the Roman era. So this particular piece we can date to around the 1st century AD, the period of the New Testament or life of Christ. And we see it because of the style. So the best way I can explain it is archaeologists can date pottery based on style. A good example, if I roll up a 1970s Corvette and a 2017 Corvette, you're going to know the difference by the body style immediately. The same idea. The styles change through the centuries, and the archaeologists can recognize those styles. Now, with our introduction out of the way, we're going to start walking backwards in history. And we're going to start with the Byzantine era, the time after Rome, and we're going to visit the monastery and the early Christian settlement at Khirbet el-Maqatir from the years 400 to 600 AD. So let's go. Welcome to the Byzantine period. The Byzantine period is the time after the fall of Rome, and we're looking at a period of history where we may say early Christianity becomes the preferred religion. This is from around 400 to 600 AD. And our first artifact from that time period is this large amphora that would be used for carrying water or wine. So this large vessel would have dated somewhere probably around the year 400 AD. When you come see it at the exhibit, you can see how archaeologists have done such a wonderful job of putting it back together. You can even see the large cracks in it here and how we use the pieces to bring an artifact back to life. Now, in this period of history, we want to talk about our site, Khirbet el-Maqatir. Khirbet el-Maqatir is 9 miles north of Jerusalem, and it's an interesting place. We're going to talk about first the monastery that was found at Khirbet el-Maqatir during this period. Now, we all have an image of monasteries, and this was the traditional type of monastery where the monks all worked together for the common good and did what they needed to do to run an efficient operation at their monastery. Now, one of the interesting things about a monastery being on an archaeological site is it's what we would call a clue, okay? And it's simply this way. If the Byzantines built a monastery on a site, they built it for a reason, not because they thought the area was pretty, but they want to honor or commemorate some event that they believed happened there. So when you find a monastery on a site in the Middle East, specifically in Israel, from the Byzantine period, you know that the Byzantine believers believe that some biblical event happened here. Now, we'll get into that as we go farther into the tour and what may have happened in the world of the Bible at Khirbet el-Maqatir. But let's talk about those monks first and their monastery, and let's take a look at a few items actually from the monastery from their world. So when I think about the monks at the monastery, one of my favorite things when I think of their world is, in a simple way, is we have part of the flooring they walked on. These little tesserae here date from 400 to 600 AD from the monastery, and there would have been numbers in excess of 30,000 of these, making a beautiful mosaic floor on the monastery on the first and second levels, is my understanding. And we see other parts of the monastery building, a Corinthian column fragment, part of a cornice. We find an oil lamp from the 5th century here, and we think they're doing some glass work. If you look at their little fragments of glass work here, we find that we have beautiful glass work from the time. A lot of people have no idea glass goes that far back in history. But two pieces I want to talk about are simple looking stone pieces here, and these are part of an ossuary lid fragment. Now, an ossuary dates to the 1st century. So why are they here in the Byzantine period? Well, first you need to know what an ossuary is, and the best way to explain it is a famous story from the Bible. We're all aware of the story of Jesus' death and burial in a tomb, and they lay him on a slab. Now, have you ever questioned, well, why don't they bury him 6 feet below like we do today? Well, the Jewish custom in the 1st century is they would put you on this slab, and basically, I believe it's about a year, they would wait for the body to decompose. And then they come back and they collect all the bones, and they put them in a bone box, an ossuary, that's only big enough to fit the longest bone in the human body, a femur. So these ossuaries date to the 1st century AD, we find 300-400 years later the fragments of a lid of an ossuary being reused at the monastery. Hey, the ancients were good at recycling, so they find this ossuary lid, so they use the pieces to go into the walls of the monastery. You have good stoneware, good stonework, reuse it. So this is the Byzantine period. Now we're going to walk a little farther back in history. We're going to go back to the 1st century to a little country called Judea that is being oppressed by the might of an empire named Rome. So we've walked a little farther back in history, and now we're in the 1st century. Under the might of Rome is a little country called Judea. So let's talk about the Romans first. The Romans had a pantheon, many gods. And on display here are a couple representations of those gods. Here we have the goddess Minerva, who is a derivative of Athena of Greece that you may know. And over here we have a fellow named Bacchus. And Bacchus had a daddy named Zeus. You've probably heard of Zeus. Well, our particular Bacchus here, I've got a feeling he doesn't like me talking about him, the stories I tell, because I talk about how he was the god of wine, intoxication, debauchery, Bacchus, debauchery, and he used to face out. And since I've been standing over here talking about him for several weeks now, he's turned his face away from me, so I have to come over here to get him to face me. So he's one of our little mysteries here at the exhibit. Why is Bacchus turning away as we talk about him? He doesn't like what we're saying. Now, behind him back here is a lady dancing with a tambourine, if you'll look close. We think she may be the Roman depiction of the Egyptian god Isis. But behind her is a figure of a Roman amphora, and here in the case below her is a real Roman amphora from around 100 to 400 AD that you would have used to transport your water, your wine, etc. Now, everything we have in the exhibit is real. It's property of an excavation or a museum, with the exception of a few really important replicas. This is a replica of a piece that was found at Caesarea Maritima in the 1960s, and the reason it's so important is it had an inscription on it. And in short, you can read the inscription. It says, a building in honor of Tiberius by Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, a very famous name from the biblical story. Now, Pilate actually had his offices, for lack of a better term, at Caesarea Maritima. It is a beautiful place. I tell people that Pilate had a beautiful office and a beautiful beach house. So he's not actually running this business in Jerusalem all the time. He's visiting there for the feasts and stuff. But you can't talk about Pilate and not talk about crucifixion. So let's go to the other side of the room and let's look at some implements that could have been used in a crucifixion 2,000 years ago. Okay, so when we talk about crucifixion, we all have an understanding of that brutal practice of execution, mainly because of the famous story from the New Testament account for the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, simply what we have on display here, creatively displayed in the form of a cross, are two nails from Rome from 2,000 years ago. Obviously, we can see that these don't look anything like the nails we go by today at Lowe's, quite of a different size in nature. But these show us the typical Roman nail, which would have probably been used in a crucifixion. Now, when we think of the crucifixion story, we also remember the story of the Roman soldier that pierces his side with a spear and blood and water come out. Well, this is a spearhead. Now, this spearhead is a little older than the New Testament story. It's Greco-Roman. It dates to 400 BC. But it is very similar, what would have been used still in the era of Jesus. And a little extra history note, if you're a fan of a movie that came out about a decade or so ago, The 300 or The 300 Spartans, the Hoplite warriors that guarded the Thermopylae Pass against the invading Persian army probably used spears with spearheads, something like this. So let's move on and let's go back to Khirbet el-Maqatir and talk about an interesting story from that site in the time of the 1st century. So we've been talking about the world of Rome, but let's step back to Judea for just a minute during the same time period, the 1st century, and let's visit Khirbet el-Maqatir again. Now I want to tell you a story, and then we're going to talk about some artifacts. In the winter archaeology season of 2013 at Khirbet el-Maqatir, Dr. Scott Stripling made a fascinating discovery. He found a hidden olive press cave. Now, on your screen, you're going to see a rendering of what it looked like in the 1st century. And you can imagine Dr. Stripling finding it full of debris up to the ceiling. And then the image you're seeing, he dug that debris all the way down to what we would call floor level. And about where you see the two guys standing in the middle of the image working, he found something fascinating. He found 8 skeletons. And then he found Roman arrowheads and Roman coins around their bodies. So he had what I like to call an archaeological mystery. Now, Dr. Stripling, being an excellent archaeologist, already had a hunch of what he was looking at. But he, being a good archaeologist, says, let's check our evidence, and he sends the bones off to be tested. Well, they come back and we have 2 bits of information. One is that these people lived in the 1st century AD. So that's not a real surprise. Again, the world of Rome. But then the second part was interesting. The 8 individuals represented, they were all women and children. 7 ladies and 1 little boy. So what's their story? Why no men? Well, that comes from the coins is our next best clue. Coins then are like coins today. They're dated. And no coin was dated after the year 69 AD. So Dr. Stripling had his answers. If you go to any history book, you will find that the country of Judea rebels against Rome in the year 66 AD. Probably a bad call. Little country rebelling against the mightiest empire on earth at the time. But anyways, that's what happens. And in the year 70 AD, the Roman army would destroy Jerusalem and the Jewish temple. Now, back up just a bit. Where did I tell you earlier Khirbet el-Maqatir was? It's 9 miles north of Jerusalem. So clearly in the year 69, we see the Roman army closing in on Jerusalem and taking out the outlying sites. Well, in this particular case, we know it's a fortified village, so clearly what is happening is the men die fighting on the walls, and the women and children are are hiding where they can. And in this case, these 7 ladies and a little boy chose to hide in the olive press cave. Well, unfortunately, the Roman army being the Roman army, no stone is left unturned. And that's where the Roman archers find them and shoot them to death. And there they lay for nearly 2,000 years before Dr. Stripling finds them. Now, that's a bit of a sad story, but it actually does something really important for us. We know the exact year these people died, the year 69 AD. And it's rare to have such a certainty in archaeology. And here's the reason you care today about these folks and how it relates to our exhibit here in Pikeville. Because once they were removed, in the soil beneath their bodies, broken in 21 pieces, was this basin, and in 6 pieces was this cup. Now, you don't have to be a world-class archaeologist to realize those 2 pieces can date no later in history than the year 69 AD. Now, Dr. Stripling, doing some comparisons, can date them to a bit earlier period, the first half of the 1st century AD. So you're looking at items from the first half of the 1st century in the world of Judea. And here's where this gets particularly exciting. Dr. Stripling believes that at the time of the 1st century, or what we call the New Testament, that Khirbet el-Maqatir is likely the biblical site of Ephraim, mentioned in the book of John, chapter 11, verses 53 and 54. If he's correct, and this is Ephraim, we can say within a historically likelihood that these 2 pieces were being used on the site when an itinerant rabbi from Nazareth and his disciples visited the location in the year 33 AD. In other words, with some degree of historical likelihood, the basin and the cup on display were likely being used at the time that Jesus of Nazareth visited the site, if this is biblical Ephraim. Now, in this limestone cup here, we can tell a very interesting story. And we're going to talk about a famous biblical story called the Last Supper. But let's back up a bit. In the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD, the Jewish people were becoming very interested with what we would call ritual purity and making sure that they were ritually pure. And one area we see this in archaeologically is in the items of everyday life they would use. Now, if you are, for example, having an important ritual meal, like a Passover meal, you would not use pottery because we learn in the book of Leviticus that pottery becomes impure after a while, but there is no such restriction on stoneware. So we see that for important ritual meals, again, a Passover meal, you would use stoneware. Now you ask yourself, the Last Supper, the famous Last Supper, what was that? Well, it was a Passover meal. And so the Jewish host of the home would have served those boys not with pottery, but with stoneware is likely what they would use. Now, the reason that's important is when we think of the cup passed at the Last Supper, and as the medievals got interested in it, what we call the Holy Grail. Well, it certainly wasn't a golden or silver medieval chalice, something like that. And what we know archaeologically now is it wouldn't have either been pottery. It's a ritual meal and they're using stoneware. So what would the cup have looked like? It's probably a stoneware cup that's popular in use at the time, like this Jerusalem area limestone cup found at Khirbet el-Maqatir. So when we look at it, we may be looking at a representation of what the Holy Grail of Last Supper fame looked like. So we were talking about the question is the modern site of Khirbet el-Maqatir, the location of biblical Ephraim mentioned in the New Testament in the book of John. Well, I could try to explain that to you, but I think I have a friend who could do a much better job. Let me introduce you to Dr. Scott Stripling, the directing archaeologist of Khirbet el-Maqatir, and he's going to answer that question for us from the site in Israel. So let's hear from Scott.
I believe there are a number of reasons that point to the site of Khirbet el-Maqatir as being Ephraim of John 11:54. First of all, the text says that it was a city near the edge of the wilderness. So when we're talking about a city, we're talking about a polis, a Greek city. Although it's small, only 5 acres in size, it is heavily fortified. The tower to the north of us is the largest tower in the country of Israel from this time period. It would have been 5 stories high. So this is a massive, heavily fortified city at the time. The wilderness I can see from here. So we are on the edge of the wilderness, which is what the Bible says. We look at the writings of Eusebius and we can find the geographical distances from Jerusalem at the time and from Bethel. They triangulate and they fit very nicely with this site. Traditionally, People have looked to a site a couple of miles from here called Tibet as Ephraim. The problem is there's no archaeological evidence to support that. They have a Byzantine tradition which was picked up by crusaders and later people. We're now saying, I think that the archaeological evidence and the geography matches this better. Josephus mentions Ephraim, Eusebius mentions Ephraim. The Marmara map has Ephraim in direct proportion to Jericho down below, Bethel to the east, which fits this site better as well. The details are in my article at maqatir.org, but we believe we're amassing a good bit of evidence that points to Khirbet el-Maqatir as being Ephraim of John 11:54.
So you've heard Dr. Stripling talk about the archaeology that answers the question, is Khirbet el-Maqatir biblical Ephraim? Now, one of the things we like to show our guests here at the exhibit is actually this image. And this is done by Dr. Rettmeyer. And this is what we would call archaeologically and architecturally correct. Often when we see images from the ancient world, they are very much the artist's imagination. But in this image, where you see a house, well, the archaeologist found the remains of a house. So this is what the site looked like 2,000 years ago. Now, one of the exciting things in our opening weekend when Dr. Stripling was here talking, that I hear him say was, he was looking at the image and talking about it, and then he picked out a house. And I believe it was this one. He said, this house. He said, we found the front door key. And as you see in the display case, we actually have the key from the house from the first century Judea, along with the pliers, everyday items that we still use today. We've got our house keys. Any home you go in is going to have a set of pliers. And ladies, we've had to look good no matter what time in history ladies are from, and we find the lady of the house's makeup applicator still with us today, 2,000 years later. Now, other things we find at the site, though, tell the grisly end of the story. You see the sling stones. You see the Roman lead projectile. And this takes us back to the end, when in 69 AD, the 10th Roman Legion and the Roman army would destroy the site of Khirbet el-Maqatir on their march towards Jerusalem. Now, one of the interesting things we have on display that ties to this whole story of the Roman destruction of Khirbet el-Maqatir and Jerusalem are these simple tile works. Now, if you look closely at them, you're going to notice you can read lettering. You'll see our fragmentary one first, and the first letter is broken, but that's an L, and then you can easily read the E and the X, which helps you read the full complete tile that says LEXFR. And what you're looking at is the abbreviation in Latin for the 10th Roman Legion. And the 10th Roman Legion is the faction of the Roman army that would actually bring destruction on Jerusalem and Khirbet el-Maqatir. One of the interesting things with these particular tiles is we were questioning whether they dated to the time of those destructions or were they a later period, and an archaeologist in Jerusalem pointed us to a tile expert in Jerusalem who responded with the following answer. Mr. Chamberlain, your tile work on display is from the 10th Roman Legion. It dates specifically to the year 70 when the Jerusalem was set siege by the Roman army and they would destroy the temple in Jerusalem, and that would have been part of one of two siege camps that the Roman army used when they had the city surrounded. So we're excited to have those on display. For our next item, we're going to stay in the world of the New Testament, and we're going to talk about a famous story from the Gospels that perhaps we've misunderstood a bit. And we're going to use this little glass vial to illuminate the story. As Dr. Stripling says, archaeology doesn't change Scripture, but it illuminates it. So we all probably know the story of the lady who washes Jesus' feet with her tears. Now, not to be sacrilegious, but let's speak frankly. It's awful hard to wash somebody's feet with tears and cry enough to do that. And part of the reason we have that image of the story is because we live in a culture 2,000 years later, and we've missed out on the practice I'm getting ready to tell you about. In the first century AD in Judea, if you were a single young lady, one of the practices you would have done is went to the market and you would have bought a glass vial, something like this one. And then when the emotions of life come, whether they be tears of joy, great grief, sadness, whatever, you would collect your tears. And then the day would come at some point when Prince Charming would come along and she would get married, and at the wedding feast she would present her tear vial to her new husband. And this would be symbolic, a way to say, my past is in my past, we're starting a new slate together. Or maybe more cynically, she was saying, hey buddy, I've cried enough in the past. If I cry any more now, it's your fault. So that's the practice. So all of a sudden, when we see the lady who washes Jesus' feet with her tears, the story comes to life when we know about this practice. And it becomes more interesting when we see how she dries his feet. She drops her hair. If you're a single young lady, one of the ways you let the world know is you wear your hair up. But when you become engaged or betrothed or married, you let it down. So this young lady, in coming and washing Jesus' feet with her tears and drying his feet with her hair, she did two things of great symbolic gestures that everyone in the room would have understood. And she's not necessarily saying, I'm going to marry this Jesus fellow, but she's certainly saying, I'm dedicated to this man for the rest of my life. So the next object we want to talk about on display in the exhibit is clearly one of the most unique displays that you'll see in the exhibit, because it simply is a box of dirt. But it's very special dirt. And it comes from a place called the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So how did we get a box of dirt from the Temple Mount? Well, about 15 or so years ago, the Islamic Trust in charge of the site did some renovations. And they bulldozed about 400 truckloads off the face of the Temple Mount and dumped it outside the city walls. And this was done without any kind of archaeological survey or work. And to say that this was a big brouhaha at the time is an understatement. Well, long story short, some local archaeology students and their famous professor was eventually given the license to sift through this soil work, and they began to find thousands of items from the First Temple period all the way through biblical history, even down to World War I. And that excavation is still going on today. So if you visit Jerusalem, you can volunteer for a day at the Temple Mount Sifting Project. We brought Dr. Barkai to speak at Pikeville, and with that relationship, they agreed to send us a box of soil from the ancient Temple Mount that has a high ash content from the Roman and Babylonian destructions from antiquity. So if you've never been to Israel before, in some small way, when you visit the exhibit and you stand by this box of soil, you'll be as close as you've ever been to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So in this display, we see examples of ancient oil lamps. Now, the display over my left shoulder gives us examples of lamps from the time of Abraham to the time of, say, the biblical kings and prophets. And what you'll notice is they appear to be different styles. Well, it's not so much a different style as different time periods, as we see the oil lamp change over the periods of history. And that's one of the great ways archaeologists, when you find an oil lamp, it's very easy to date to a specific period. Now, in the case here to my right, we find examples from the Roman and Byzantine era. And the big one in the back is from a famous place called Petra. And basically what you would do is use these lamps. You put your oil in the big hole in the middle, your wick here, and that would be your lamp. Now, you would use olive oil often to burn with these. And one of the examples that we like to show people that maybe when you visit the exhibit, you'll get a chance to hold and touch is our first century Judean oil lamp. You can see it's very simple. There's no decorative elements on this particular lamp. And it comes from the world of the New Testament, circa life of Christ and the apostles. Welcome to Money of the Bible. In this section, we see money from the world of the biblical era, and we see money struck in the name of famous people like Pontius Pilate, Tiberius Caesar, Herod the Great. And we find money from famous stories in the Bible. For example, the little lady that brought all that she had, 2 mites. Well, if you've ever wondered what the 2 mites look like, you can see 2 of them here on display. Now today we're going to talk about one specific coin, the shekel of Tyre. Tyre was a Phoenician city where these coins were struck, but they had a big impact on the world of the New Testament, and here's why. If you went to the temple and you had to pay your temple tax, well, your prutas, your bronze coins and such, they were no good. You had to exchange them for one coin, the shekel of Tyre. Now, you would take those to the money changers, and the money changers would then change your coins into these, probably charging you an exorbitant fee. Now, this is where we find the story of Jesus turning over the money changers' tables, and he's cracking the whip, and he's getting angry. And what's he so upset about? Well, here's a couple thoughts on why that may be. Number one, I just told you these money changers are charging a fee. But number two, let's look at that coin itself. Now, the image you see on the front of that, you probably assume right off that's probably Caesar at the time, but it is not. It is a pagan god called Melkart. Some experts even believe Melkart's a derivative of an older god called Baal. So here at the Jewish temple of the one true God, you can only pay your temple tax with a coin with a pagan deity's image on it. You could know that probably wouldn't fly. But why is this happening? Well, my understanding is the rabbis at the time had passed a special rule. And they said that we only will accept this one coin. And why is it? Well, if you lived in the ancient world, the shekel of Tyre had the most pure silver content of any coin. So I like to think that what's going on here is a money racket. And basically we see why Jesus is getting so angry. Now, this coin also figures into another famous biblical story. If I just told you that the only silver coin that the temple will accept is the shekel of Tyre, and they give 30 pieces of silver for Judas to betray Jesus, what did they give him? 30 of those. So as promised, I said we'd walk farther and farther back in history. So now we're leaving the world of Rome and the New Testament and walking back to the world of the Old Testament, where we're going to talk about the might of the Mesopotamian empires, places like Assyria, Babylon, and Persia. And we're going to start with Assyria. Now, Assyria was the empire that would be famous for carrying off the lost 10 tribes of Israel, as we call them. In the time after Solomon, we see the country divide. You have a northern kingdom that is called Israel and a southern kingdom that's called Judah. And the Assyrian Empire would destroy the northern kingdom entirely, and then they would come to Judah with kind of the same plan. And they would destroy many of the cities, almost all of the cities of Judah, save one, a place called Jerusalem. Now, what's interesting is we have the biblical version of the story, and we have the man who's in charge of the Assyrian Empire, King Sennacherib, his version. Now, the tall stele here, this is called the Annals of Sennacherib. Now, this one is a replica. The original is in the British Museum, but it tells the story from Sennacherib's version. And what's fascinating is when he comes to the story of Jerusalem, we see how the two sides tacitly agree. As Sennacherib says, "And at Jerusalem ushered up Hezekiah, like a bird in a cage." And he mentions some tribute and moves on. So the two parties both agree there was no destruction at Jerusalem. The difference is in the biblical version, you get God's deliverance of the Hebrew people. Now, at this time, we're talking about Hezekiah. And the one reason we wanted to talk about him so much is a couple of artifacts that most people that visit the exhibit just walk past. And they're easily top 10 type things. And here you see one of them. It's just a broken jar handle from the 7th century BC. But if you look at it close, you'll see that there's a seal impression in it. Now, the copies we have on display are very worn, but about 2,000 of these have been discovered at sites that constitute ancient Judea. And in copies that are in pristine shape, we discovered that there is Hebrew lettering on that seal. And it's called a Lamech seal, LMLK, and it translates simply as belonging to the king. And we know what king it was. It was King Hezekiah of Judah. So when you visit the exhibit, you can actually see a seal impression of one of the kings of the Bible. We're very proud to have that on display, and to our knowledge, it's the first one of these that has ever visited the mountains of central Appalachia. So after the Assyrian Empire, it would be the Babylonian Empire that would rise. They would conquer the Assyrians, and that would be the empire that becomes famous in the Bible. In the book of Daniel, let's say, the stories of Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Babylon is also most famous for the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BC when they would destroy the city and Solomon's temple. Now, this destruction came under a king named Nebuchadnezzar, again, the famous king of the book of Daniel. And we're very proud to have on display one of my favorite objects in the exhibit, which is a simple brick from Babylon. But in this brick, we find a stamp impression. If you can look here close near the central part of the brick, you'll see the stamp impression, and it's cuneiform. And the Horn Museum has provided us the translation of this cuneiform tablet, and it simply translates as Nebuchadnezzar, King of Babylon. So here we have a brick on display in our exhibit mentioning the name of the famous king of the book of Daniel and of the ancient world, Nebuchadnezzar himself. So these Babylonians we're discussing would carry off the Hebrew people into exile, again, the book of Daniel. Now, at the end of the Babylonian period, we see the rise of a place called Persia under a man we now call Cyrus the Great. And Cyrus and Persia would dominate and conquer Babylonia, and they would allow the Hebrew people to return home, to go back to the land, to rebuild the temple. Now, we also see how he did this with other peoples. For example, we have a replica of the Cyrus cylinder that's found in the British Museum today. This replica is made from the original, and it tells the story of how Cyrus the Great would allow people that had been removed by the Empire of Babylon to return to their homelands and to take the implements of their houses of worship back to where they were from. Now, Persia would be the last great Mesopotamian empire, that would dominate the world of the Bible. Because at the end of this period, a man named Alexander from Greece would conquer the known world. And under Alexander the Great, from this period on, it would be the West, Greece, and then Rome, that would dominate the world of the Bible. When you talk about the world of the Old Testament and the history of those times, you can't talk about it and not talk about warfare. So in our weapons section at the exhibit, we chose 2 weapons to show you here today in our preview presentation. And we're going to start with these 2 swords. These are swords. You may look at these and think, oh, it's like a long dagger or whatever. And you may see the sword in the back here. Well, that one's more ceremonial. When we think of a long sword or a sword, we often think of a medieval knight and his big long sword. Well, in the world of the Bible, it's something more like this. For example, in the book of Judges, you find a judge named Ehud, and he's going in to basically do a sneak attack on a fat Moabite king. And he's left-handed. So he hides on his right thigh his sword that is about 18 inches long, probably very similar to what we have on display. So when you think about swords in the Bible, here we have 2 very fine examples of what those would have looked like. Now, let's go back and talk about a fellow named Abraham for just a second, and a famous story where he's about to sacrifice Isaac before the word comes from the angel not to do it. And let's look at a dagger from that period of history. So one of my favorite weapons on display is this simple dagger. The Dorsey Museum tells me this dates to 2200 BC, and it's from Samaria. So we're in the ballpark of the story I was just telling as we imagine Abraham holding the dagger over Isaac, getting ready to sacrifice him, and then the word from the angel comes for him to stop. So when we imagine that story, maybe it's a dagger something like this that he's holding. In another step back in history, we've now landed in the Iron Age. This is the period of the biblical kings and prophets and the end of the period of the Judges period. So 1200 to 586, 587 BC. On display, we have a pottery collection from the period, starting in the early part of the period, maybe the book of the Judges, into the period where we see names like David, Solomon, and Hezekiah, Jeremiah, Isaiah come to the world of the Bible and the world of history. So let's take a moment and focus on one of those names, and let's talk about a man named David. David, mentioned in the Bible, the king of Israel, has always been a hot topic archaeologically. And the reason for that is up to 25 years ago, there was no evidence for a man named David outside of the Bible, other than some circumstantial evidence. So some experts have concluded maybe David never existed. Maybe he was like King Arthur, a fictional creation. But then at Tel Dan, in the early to mid-90s, an interesting discovery was made. And on display here, we have a world-class copy of the stele that was discovered in, I believe, 1993 at Tel Dan. And on the stele, we find an Armenian king who has conquered Dan in the 9th century BC, and he's bragging about these 2 kings that basically he whooped up on. And he mentions first the king of Israel, the northern kingdom. Then he comes to talk about the king of a place called Judah. And we would expect him to say Judah, but instead he says, the king of the house of David. And for the first time outside of the Bible, we find the name of King David mentioned in the historical records. Now, when we think of the David and Goliath story, we often think of a little boy with a slingshot and a pebble, and we've certainly got it wrong. On display here, you can see a replica of an ancient sling, and you can see how the long straps of leather would have been. And then we have here 4 ancient sling stones, and as you can see, they're quite of some size. Well, historians and archaeologists have done studies, and they tell us when you get that sling up and you get it going and you let it go, that sling stone is going around 150 miles an hour. So in other words, incredibly fast. Now, when you visit the exhibit, you might get a chance to actually hold a real sling stone from the Iron Age of ancient Israel. And you can feel the weight of this thing, and you can imagine what it would be like for that to hit you in the head at 150 miles an hour. And all of a sudden, the story of David and Goliath, maybe we have a new perspective when we hear the giant Goliath say, hey, come over here where I can get my hands on you. Maybe he realized, hey, if that young man is good with that sling, maybe I have a problem. So as we move even farther back in history, we come to the late Bronze Age. And we find one of my favorite objects in the exhibit, and it's a simple mud brick. This comes from a site called Tel Beit Shemesh, and it dates to around 1400 to 1350 BC is my understanding. And so we've all heard of a mud brick, and it's a simple brick, and maybe you would walk past this in the exhibit, but I want to tell you a wonderful story. This comes from the site of Tel Beit Shemesh, and at this site we actually know where the brick comes from. It comes from the Canaanite ruler's palace on this site. And what's fascinating is we know her name. Yes, one of the rare female ancient rulers. Her name is Ninur Mamesh, or better said probably in the English, Lady of the Lions. And this Lady of the Lions is historically important and famous because we actually have 2 letters that she wrote. And she wrote these letters to the Pharaoh of Egypt about this time. And I want you to listen carefully to part of what she had to say. She said, in part, "May the king or the Pharaoh, my lord, know that war has been waged in the land, and gone is the land of the king, my lord, by desertion to the Aparu or the Habaru." In another letter, "May the king, my lord, save his land from the power of the Aparu or the Habaru, lest it be lost." So this Lady of the Lions, like many other Canaanite rulers, wrote these letters complaining to the Pharaoh in Egypt to send help, to send the military. And what we know is the military would never come. So while we're talking about Egypt, let's take a moment and let's visit the Valley of the Kings, the burial ground of the pharaohs of the great Egyptian dynasties. Welcome to our Egyptian tomb. Now, you can't visit Egypt and not see our sarcophagus mask. Now, our particular sarcophagus mask is interesting. It's ceramic, and it actually doesn't come from Egypt. It comes from Canaan. Now, we call this an Egyptian sarcophagus mask because we're not exactly sure what's happening here. Is this an Egyptian officer that's in Canaan at a border outpost? Is it people who are being influenced by their trade with Egypt and they're copying kind of the idea here? Well, we're not really sure. But what we do know is that this dates to around the period of 1400 to 1000 BC, and it's either an Egyptian officer or it's some Egyptian influence. And what we have left here is the face portion of the sarcophagus lid. Now, below the sarcophagus mask, we find 3 figurines with hieroglyphics on them. And these are ubshaptis. And these date to the period of the New Kingdom and later in Egypt. And these would be basically servants that would be put into the tomb that would be used to assist you in the afterlife. So they would do the work. So in the afterlife, it's better than this life. They do the work for you and you don't have to do it here. And so we have our 3 figurines here that were meant to serve an Egyptian, probably noble, at some point in his afterlife. In ancient Egypt, the dung beetle had a special reverence. And it was because the ancient Egyptians believed that the dung beetle helped carry the sun through the sky. And so on their scarabs, little amulets, they emulated the dung beetle. And we have one here, a very important scarab. Now, a scarab could be used as an amulet or an official seal. Maybe you wanted to pick a famous pharaoh that was a great warrior if you wanted luck in warfare. So different purposes. Maybe they were worn on a string around your neck or around your wrist, but they had different purposes. Now, this particular scarab was very, very important. It has a figure of it, of an ankh, and we found a lion with a falcon's head. And this particular scarab dates to the reign of Amenhotep II. So around 485 to 1415 or so BC. Now that dating is incredibly important because of where this was found. This little scarab was found in the soil undisturbed of a fortress at the late Bronze Age site of Khirbet el-Maqatir, dating to 1500 to 1400 BC. And scarabs, like coins, are important because they help us date, and dating is important. And what you're about to discover is this little scarab was incredibly important to provide a date to that fortress, which the archaeologists believe is the biblical site of Ai, mentioned in the book of Joshua, chapters 7 and 8. And this little artifact, for that reason, was voted the #1 biblical archaeological discovery of the year 2013 in the publication Christianity Today. Now that you've seen our so important scarab and explained how it relates to the story of the biblical Ai of Joshua 7 and 8, let's back up a bit and talk about the archaeology of the place. Well, since the mid to late 1800s, archaeologists have known where a place called Jericho is. And Jericho is a famous story in Joshua's conquest. But the next place is a place called Ai. And the archaeologists have thought they've known where Ai was for many, many years. And the reason for that is in the Middle East, most archaeological sites have ruins built on top of ruins on top of ruins. and they create what we call a tell, or an artificial hill. And when you look at the Bible for clues of where Ai would be located, there's only one tell in the area, and it's at a place called Et-Tel. Well, in the 1960s to the early 70s, archaeologists finally were able to excavate at Et-Tel, expecting to find the fortress ruins of Ai. And unfortunately, there was nothing there from the time of Joshua, not even close. It was other periods. Some experts concluded that the biblical story of Ai was fictitious. Well, when we go back in history a bit, and you go back to the earlier 1800s, and you have explorers, the first explorers, before all the experts decided where everything was, they would ask the locals, "Where is Ai?" And they would do a strange thing. They would point to this out-of-the-way place where there seemed to be nothing, called Khirbet el-Maqatir. Well, finally in the 1990s, some archaeologists under Dr. Bryant Wood decided to excavate at Khirbet el-Maqatir. And in those excavations, they found a late Bronze Age fortress that dates to the period of the book of Joshua. And what's fascinating is, as they excavated at Khirbet el-Maqatir, they were very careful to look at their evidence. And we see geographical and archaeological indicators. When you visit the exhibit, you can go through and you see how the Bible indicates that there are certain geographical indicators that must be present for a site to be the Ai mentioned in the book of Joshua 7 or 8. Well, the site at Khirbet el-Maqatir meets all of them. Then if you look at the archaeology is the same thing. It's from the time period. It's from the time of the late Bronze Age, the period of the conquest. The site must be burned. Well, they find the ash pockets across the entire site. And we can even show you pottery that was subjected to an intense fire when the fortress was burned somewhere around the year 1400 BC. So, is the late Bronze Age fortress at Khirbet el-Maqatir the lost fortress of Ai? Well, when you visit the exhibit, you can examine the evidence for yourself and make up your own mind. But I can tell you the archaeologists who excavated the site, they certainly think it is. The item we're looking at here is a jar from the late Bronze Age, from the fortress we're talking about, dating to around between the 1500 and 1400 BC period. And this was used for the burial of an infant. You can see here that the bottom has been cut away so that the baby's body could be fit into the jar. Now, this is not some dark story, but probably what's happening here is the child was probably beloved. And the child didn't live much past birth or around the time of birth. And so the family decided to bury the baby with the family beneath the floor of the home they lived in. I would compare it much to cremation today when we keep the loved one in an urn on the mantle. It's kind of the same idea. Now the interesting thing is this comes from the fortress at Ai, or Khirbet el-Maqatir, and it would have been probably in the section that was the commander's quarters of the site. And in a way, interestingly, this discovery helps confirm one of the biblical comments about the place. It says men and women were killed at the site in Joshua 8. And that's interesting because in an out-of-the-way border fortress, you wouldn't expect to find women. But here at this site, we find a confirmation in the biblical record yet again of how women were at the site of Ai that were destroyed by the Israelite invaders around 1400 BC. So with the baby buried in the jar, there were other things found with the burial. And one of them was this common cook pot, which was a strange practice. You would have expected a more expensive item, but yet this is an out-of-the-way fortress. It's not in the metro area. So they're using what they can. And we find other things like an incense stand and other items buried with the baby to assist it in the afterlife. So here we see objects from the late Bronze Age fortress at Khirbet el-Maqatir, the likely site of Ai, that date to 3,500 years ago on display right here in Pikeville, Kentucky. As we walk into the final section of the exhibit, we find some of the oldest artifacts on display. For example, in this case, we find artifacts from the late Bronze Age, the same period we were just talking about from the fortress of Ai, and these date to around 1550 to 1200 BC. In the period that archaeologists call the Middle Bronze Age, we're circa 2000 BC to 1550 BC, and we find beautiful items like this large vase here, this large storage jar that dates to Middle Bronze 1. So this is circa 2000 BC or 4,000 years old. Probably made around the same time as the life of a fellow named Abraham, for example. So now let's go check on things that are even a little bit older and what archaeologists call the early bronze. The early Bronze Age are items that I call really old. We're talking about a period in history that lasted from about 3200 BC to around 2000 BC. Now the oldest object we have on display in the museum exhibit is actually this little spouted jar, and everybody's interested in it because it dates to early Bronze 1, which is ballpark 3,200 to 3,000 BC. In other words, is in excess of 5,000 years old. The remaining artifacts are from a site called Babet Dra. Now, Babet Dra is really interesting because some archaeologists believe that Babet Dra is a site mentioned in the Bible called Sodom. Now, I like to mention that because it helps bring interest to the items, but to quote one archaeologist, anytime you have two archaeologists, you have at least three opinions, and two archaeologists that work together that I have a large respect for. One says, Babet Dra is probably Sodom, and the other guy says, heck no, no way, it's probably not. So I love to challenge people and say, hey, when you think about this site, Babet Dra, look it up for yourself, look at the evidence, and make up your own mind. As we come to our final object for today's presentation, we actually walk back a little bit in time to the mid-90s when this all began, when Dr. Wood began excavations at Khirbet el-Maqatir, and it would eventually, the evidence would support that he had discovered biblical eye. And one of the first items they discovered in that excavation season was a gate socket stone, like the one on display here. When you visit the exhibit, you can see in this large stone piece a hollow area where the pivot for the gate would have been that would turn the gate in the gateway for the site of eye. So the story of this exhibit in Pikeville, Kentucky really started all those years ago when the story started on the site of Khirbet el-Maqatir, and Dr. Wood and the team began excavations that would eventually lead to the evidence that would support they discovered the biblical site of eye. So we hope that you come to the exhibit and you get the opportunity to see these artifacts for yourself and see the evidence and decide, does the evidence support? Have they found the lost fortress of Ai, or have they not? I believe you'll discover, like we have, the evidence says, yes, they have. I hope you've enjoyed your journey through biblical history with us and your journey through the history of a site called Khirbet el-Maqatir. We're very proud to have this world-class biblical archaeology exhibit on display in Pikeville, Kentucky through the end of this summer this year, 2017. This is an exhibit like something you'd only usually find in a large metro area, so we're very proud that this is here in small town America just for you to come visit. Now, you have opportunities to do so on the weekends. We're open from Friday evenings from 1 to 5 and Saturdays from 9 to 5. But the exciting thing is you as an individual or family or even a group can even book private events here and come see it when we have the doors open just for you. Now, how do you go about doing that? Well, first you can contact us by email at exhibit@upike.edu. Again, exhibit@upike.edu. And if you just want to learn more, go to www.upike.edu/exhibit. Again, the website is www.upike.edu/exhibit. So we hope you take advantage of this opportunity where we have a world-class exhibit that you can come down and discover the ancient world of the Bible for yourself right here in Pikeville, Kentucky.